It was supposed to be the most relaxing moment of his week, sunlight dancing across the surface of his crystal blue pool, the faint sound of smooth jazz drifting from the outdoor speakers, and the calm satisfaction of a man who had built his success from the ground up. But within minutes, that peace shattered when police officers marched through his gated property, demanding proof that he belonged at the home he had bought, renovated, and poured his heart into. What followed wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a shocking display of bias, assumption, and arrogance that would cost every officer involved their careers. Welcome back to Swift Tale, where we dive into powerful stories that reveal truth, challenge assumptions, and shine a light on real-world issues. And if this is your first time here, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because have you ever been judged for simply being where you're supposed to be? Today's story is one that matters, not just because it exposes injustice, but because it shows what real power looks like when used with calm dignity rather than anger. In this video, we're exploring the unbelievable moment when a black millionaire, wealthy, respected, and quietly successful, was hassled at his own pool by police who refused to believe he lived there. They didn't ask politely. They didn't verify facts. They didn't even consider that he might simply be the owner. Instead, they escalated, interrogated, and pushed boundaries that no homeowner should ever experience. But here, where the story takes an unexpected turn, with a single phone call, this man completely flipped the situation, and by the time the dust settled, every officer involved was out of a job. What happened? Why did they approach him at all? And how did one call lead to a departmental shakeup none of them saw coming? This story matters because it highlights a truth many people already know too well. Sometimes, prejudice speaks louder than policy. Sometimes, authority acts before understanding. And sometimes, people are forced to defend their right to exist in spaces they paid for, earned, and built. But it also matters because it shows what happens when bias collides with the wrong person, someone educated, connected, calm under pressure, and unwilling to tolerate disrespect on his own property. This is a story about boundaries crossed, accountability enforced, and justice delivered in a way that leaves a ripple far beyond one poolside afternoon. Before the confrontation that would shake the entire police department, it's important to understand exactly who this man was, the one they assumed didn't belong at his own home. His name was Marcus Ellington, a self-made millionaire whose journey from a cramped two-bedroom apartment to a sprawling mansion with a private pool wasn't luck or inheritance, but the result of years of discipline, late nights, and relentless focus. Born to hardworking parents who always emphasized education, Marcus learned early that success wasn't guaranteed, not for someone who looked like him, and not in a world where opportunities were unevenly distributed. He studied, sacrificed, and built his wealth step by step, eventually becoming the CEO of a fast-growing tech firm known for empowering minority entrepreneurs. Despite his financial success, Marcus never carried himself with arrogance. He was grounded, soft-spoken, and deeply protective of his privacy. His home, tucked behind tall gates, lush landscaping, and advanced security systems, was his sanctuary, a place where he could disconnect from the demands of leadership and the pressures of public expectation. The property itself was stunning. A sleek modern mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows, marble finishes, and a pool that curved around the back patio, like a mirror reflecting the sky. The backyard was filled with quiet beauty, palm trees swaying gently, a stone fireplace for cool evenings, and lounge chairs positioned perfectly for morning sun. Every detail had been chosen intentionally, not to flaunt wealth, but to create a peaceful environment where Marcus could unwind, reconnect with himself, and enjoy the life he worked tirelessly to achieve. And although he could have lived anywhere in the world, Malibu, Manhattan, Palm Springs, he chose this neighborhood because he believed in investing in his community, not escaping it. Still, he wasn't naive. He knew that not everyone welcomed his success. He knew that some neighbors made assumptions about him long before ever saying hello. Marcus's daily routine reflected the balance he tried to maintain. In the mornings, he often exercised by the pool or reviewed business reports on a cushioned lounger while sipping a protein shake. Afternoons were for meetings, calls, and planning expansions for the youth programs he funded. Evenings were for family, his younger sister who visited often, his niece who loved swimming in the backyard, and friends who saw his home not as a mansion, but as a space filled with warmth. And on certain days, like the one when everything changed, Marcus allowed himself rare moments of stillness, casual swim shorts, sunglasses, a playlist of relaxing music, and the simple joy of floating in the pool without thinking about deadlines or obligations. But beneath his calm surface was a history many didn't know. Marcus had experienced discrimination before, subtle comments, suspicious stares in luxury stores, assumptions about his car, questions about whether he really lived here. None of those moments stopped him from moving forward, but they stayed with him, shaping his awareness. He knew that wealth didn't shield him from bias. Success didn't exempt him from stereotypes, and respect wasn't always given equally. Still, he never expected that such a blatant invasion of his peace would happen right in his own backyard. So when Marcus stepped into his pool that afternoon, feeling the warm water wrap around him and the sun glow against his skin, the last thing on his mind was conflict. He wasn't thinking about anything except the serenity he had earned. But little did he know, somewhere nearby, a neighbor was peering over the fence with suspicion, convinced that the man enjoying the pool didn't belong there. Little did he know that a call had already been made to police claiming a trespasser. And little did he know that officers were already heading his way, uninformed, unprepared, and ready to treat him as anything but the homeowner he was. While Marcus enjoyed the rare quiet of his afternoon, a very different energy brewed next door. His neighbor, Ellen Whitfield, had been watching him for weeks, though watching was putting it lightly. Ellen was the self-appointed neighborhood guardian, a woman whose days revolved around her porch, binoculars, and a deep belief that she alone knew who belonged and who didn't. She wasn't malicious in her own mind, just concerned, vigilant, and protective of property values, as she often described herself at community meetings. But beneath her faux politeness lived a set of biases she refused to acknowledge, biases that shaped every assumption she made about Marcus from the moment he moved in. Despite seeing him pull into the driveway in luxury cars, despite watching delivery workers call him sir, despite witnessing family members greet him at the door, in her mind something never quite fit, and she interpreted every normal action he took through a lens of suspicion. That afternoon, when Ellen stepped onto her balcony with her iced tea in hand, she spotted Marcus in the pool. He was relaxed, smiling to himself, headphones on, completely unaware that someone was scrutinizing him from behind a row of hedges. Ellen narrowed her eyes, convinced she was witnessing something out of place. No owner would just lounge around like that in the middle of the day, she muttered to herself. Must be someone sneaking in. The idea would have sounded ridiculous to anyone with common sense, but Ellen's thoughts didn't follow logic. They followed her fears, stereotypes, and imagined scenarios she'd cultivated for years. And the moment she interpreted Marcus's peace as a threat, she rushed back inside to grab her phone. She dialed 911, her voice trembled, not with fear, but with excitement, the kind people get when they believe they're doing something important. Yes, hello, she began, breathing heavily for dramatic effect. I'd like to report a trespasser at my neighbor's home. The dispatcher asked for details, and Ellen leaned into the moment like an actress delivering her biggest scene. Well, I don't recognize him. He looks suspicious. He's in their backyard pool. I don't know how he got in. Maybe he broke in. He doesn't look like the owner. He's just lounging there like he owns the place. She exaggerated her tone, inserting coded language she thought sounded helpful. The dispatcher, hearing her urgency, logged the incident as a possible intruder. When she hung up, Ellen stepped back outside, peeking between the rails of her balcony. Her heart pounded not from danger, but from the thrill of believing she was saving the neighborhood. She didn't consider for a moment what this call could lead to. She didn't imagine the humiliation it could cause, and she certainly didn't think about the possibility that she was the one in the wrong. In her mind, this was her duty: call, report, intervene. She felt empowered, almost righteous. Minutes later, she spotted movement on the street, 2 patrol cars pulling up quietly, officers stepping out with rigid posture and hands hovering near their belts. Ellen's pulse surged as she hurried to get a better view. She watched them walk with purpose toward Marcus's gate, their eyes scanning the property as though expecting danger. Her breath caught with a mix of nervous anticipation and self-satisfaction. This was her moment, proof that she was, once again, the neighborhood's silent savior. Meanwhile, Marcus remained blissfully unaware, floating on his back as sunlight shimmered over the water. He didn't notice the officers approaching through the side path, didn't see Ellen watching, didn't sense the storm gathering around a situation that never should have existed in the first place. He was simply enjoying his home, his peace, completely oblivious to the fact that someone's prejudice had just summoned authority to his doorstep. For Ellen, those next quiet seconds felt like triumph. For Marcus, they were the final seconds of calm before the intrusion. And for the officers, they were the beginning of an encounter they believed would be routine, but would instead spiral into a conflict that would leave them stunned. The quiet afternoon cracked open the moment the officers stepped through the side gate, boots crunching against the stones with a force that immediately shifted the energy of the space. Officers Reed and Callahan, two men with years on the job but very different temperaments, walked in already armed with the narrative Ellen had fed the dispatcher. To them, this wasn't a welfare check, nor a friendly verification call. It was a possible break-in, a trespasser, a suspect who might become violent if confronted. The tone of Ellen's 911 report had already shaped their expectations, tightening their muscles and quickening their steps. As they moved deeper onto the property, they saw the backyard open up in front of them, the shimmering pool, the manicured garden, and in the center of it all, Marcus floating calmly, unaware that his piece was moments away from being detonated. Officer Reed's jaw clenched slightly as he observed the scene. He whispered, "Doesn't look like someone who lives here." Callahan nodded, scanning the perimeter, hand resting deliberately on his holster, even though there was no real sign of danger. Their training told them to assess objectively, but their assumptions, formed long before they stepped foot on the property, told a different story. And when assumptions lead, logic often gets left behind. The officers didn't consider that a millionaire could relax in his own pool during the day. They didn't consider that wealth comes in many forms and appearances. They barely considered that the 911 caller might simply be wrong. Instead, they approached Marcus as someone who didn't belong here. As the sun glinted off the water, Marcus finally noticed movement from the corner of his eye. His head lifted slightly, at first thinking it was one of his assistants or a delivery person coming to drop something off. But the moment he saw the police uniforms, his eyebrows lowered in confusion rather than fear. He removed his headphones and stood chest-deep in the water. "Can I help you, officers?" he said calmly, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and irritation. But Reed responded with authority, not courtesy. "Sir, step out of the pool immediately, hands where we can see them." The abruptness of his tone hit Marcus harder than the words themselves. This wasn't a friendly wellness check, it was an accusation disguised as a command. Marcus blinked, unsure if he had misheard. "Step out of my pool? For what reason?" he asked, water dripping from his fingertips as he raised his hands slightly, not out of fear, but to emphasize the absurdity. Callahan stepped forward, already escalating the situation with his posture. "We received a report of a trespasser on this property. We need to confirm your identity and why you're here." The emphasis on the word trespasser carried a sting Marcus felt immediately, turning a peaceful afternoon into a demeaning interrogation. His frustration simmered, but he controlled it. "This is my home," he stated firmly. "I live here, I own this property." But Reed gave a slow, skeptical nod, unimpressed. "We'll need ID to verify that." Marcus stared at them, incredulous. "You want ID? While I'm literally in a pool, you walked past 2 security cameras and a coded gate. But you think I broke in?" But logic was no match for the story the officers had written in their minds before arriving. They didn't want explanations, they wanted compliance. Meanwhile, from her balcony, Ellen leaned forward eagerly, watching the scene unfold with a strange sense of satisfaction. She believed she was witnessing her assumptions come to life, unaware that she was the architect of this entire unnecessary confrontation. To her, every moment validated her intuition. To Marcus, every second deepened his disbelief. Reed signaled for Marcus to move toward the steps. Marcus hesitated, knowing that sudden movements, especially as a black man dealing with officers primed for conflict, could be misinterpreted. "I will step out slowly," he said, trying to maintain the peace the officers seemed determined to disturb. As he walked up the pool steps, Callahan took a step closer, hand hovering near his weapon again, as if Marcus were a threat instead of a homeowner. Marcus paused and stared at him. "Really? Is that necessary?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The officer didn't answer. That silence said everything. The backyard, once a sanctuary of calm, had transformed into a zone of suspicion. And all the while, Marcus's mind raced, not with fear, but with the sharp awareness that something far bigger than a misunderstanding was unfolding. These officers weren't just reacting to a call, they were reacting to a narrative shaped by bias, fueled by assumptions, and intensified by their own unchecked expectations. But what they didn't yet know, what neither officer nor neighbor could have imagined, was that Marcus was far more influential, far more connected, and far more prepared than they could ever have expected. The moment they chose to escalate rather than listen, they set themselves on a path toward consequences far beyond anything they were ready to face. And the next interaction would change everything. As Marcus stepped out of the pool, water trailing down his skin and forming ripples on the stone deck, the tension in the air thickened. The officers had arrived with a story in their heads, and every second that passed seemed to cement that story further. Officer Reed's eyes narrowed as he took in Marcus's composure, too calm, he thought, for someone caught. Callahan, meanwhile, scanned the backyard as if expecting accomplices to jump out from behind the rose bushes. They weren't here to verify, they were here to confirm their suspicion. And when people come looking for guilt, they usually find it, even when it isn't there. "All right," Reed said sharply, "we're going to need ID. Now." Marcus raised an eyebrow, water still dripping from his hair. "Again," he said slowly, emphasizing his words like he was talking to children, "I just told you I live here. I own this house. I am standing in swim trunks. Where exactly do you expect me to pull an ID from?" Reed looked irritated, as though Marcus was intentionally making things difficult. "Don't get smart. We need identification." Marcus exhaled, steady and controlled. "My wallet is inside the house. I can go get it, but only if you're not going to treat me like I'm fleeing my own property." But Callahan raised his hand immediately. "No sudden movements. We'll escort you." Marcus blinked. "Escort me into my own home?" The question hung in the air like a challenge neither officer cared or was prepared to answer. They simply stood there, forming a barrier, two uniformed figures asserting authority where none was warranted. Marcus could feel his patience splintering. It wasn't the request for ID that was annoyingly standard in situations like this. It was the tone, the assumption, the subtle but unmistakable belief that he didn't belong in the luxury surrounding him. He inhaled, then took a small, deliberate step toward the sliding glass door. Immediately, both officers tensed. Reed's hand hovered toward his taser. Callahan spread his feet slightly, bracing. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. "Are you serious?" he asked, incredulous. "You asked me to get my ID. Now you're acting like me walking to get it is a threat." Reed's voice sharpened. "We need you to follow instructions." "And I need you," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level, "to explain what instruction I'm not following." There was no good answer. Reed didn't give one. Instead, he shot a glance at Callahan, the kind of silent communication that often leads to bad decisions. And sure enough, Callahan stepped forward, taking a more aggressive stance. "Sir," he said, "we don't know who you are. We need you to comply until we can verify your identity." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Do you hear yourselves? I am standing on my property, on my deck, in my pool. How much more proof do you need that I live here?" But proof wasn't what they wanted. They wanted obedience. They wanted control. And they wanted Marcus to shrink, to fit the version of him they had decided on before ever stepping into the yard. From the balcony, Ellen watched with the unsettling enthusiasm of a spectator at a drama she had scripted. She sipped her drink, convincing herself she'd done the right thing, unaware she was about to witness the collapse of her carefully curated delusion. "Sir, turn around," Reed snapped suddenly. Marcus blinked. "Turn around for what?" "For our safety," Reed replied, his voice clipped. That was the line, the one officers used when they felt the situation slipping from their grasp. When justification was thin, officer safety became the shield that excused everything. Marcus knew this game. He'd seen it before, he'd heard it before, and he wasn't going to play along. "No," Marcus said firmly. "I'm not turning around so you can cuff me on my own patio, because a neighbor doesn't understand what a homeowner looks like. I will get you my ID. I will walk slowly, but I will not be handcuffed for existing in my own space. Callahan stepped closer, the tension in the air sizzling like static. That's resisting. It's not resisting, Marcus replied. It's me setting a boundary. Reed took another step forward, frustration turning into irritation, irritation turning into something reckless. If you won't comply, we'll make you. That sentence struck Marcus like a slap, not because he was afraid, they didn't know who they were dealing with, but because he realized something important in that moment. They weren't here to verify a report. They were here to assert dominance, to remind him of their authority, and they thought they could. A calm coldness settled over him. His expression shifted, not fearful, not angry, but resolute. You're making a very big mistake, he said quietly, the kind of quiet that carried weight neither officer understood. What's that supposed to mean? Callahan barked, taking yet another step. It means, Marcus said, meeting their stares head-on, that you have no idea who you're talking to. And you're seconds away from consequences you can't even imagine. The officers stiffened, misinterpreting his warning as a threat rather than a statement of fact. Reed's hand fully gripped his taser now, his voice sharp as a blade. Sir, last warning, turn around. Marcus didn't move, didn't flinch. The only sound was the water dripping from his fingertips onto the stone. The situation had reached a breaking point, and the officers were about to step into a level of trouble that would shake their entire department. Because while they saw a suspect, they had completely missed the truth. Marcus wasn't just a millionaire. He was someone whose single phone call could, and soon would, change their lives forever. Marcus stood there, the warm afternoon sun drying the droplets on his skin as the officers in front of him grew more agitated by the second. He wasn't afraid, frustrated, yes, irritated, absolutely, but fear was nowhere in him. Years of running high-level operations, negotiating under pressure, and thinking several steps ahead had trained him to remain composed even when others spiraled. But today wasn't supposed to be a test of emotional endurance. Today was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon by the pool, an escape from constant meetings, business calls, and the pressure of being a millionaire with a public profile. Instead, he found himself faced with two officers who had shown up convinced they were confronting a criminal, and it didn't matter how calm he remained, they were escalating no matter what he did. Officers, Marcus began slowly, as if speaking to children having a tantrum, let's do this another way. I'll call my assistant. She can bring out my ID, my property documents, whatever you need. I don't want this to escalate further. But Reed scoffed, his posture stiffening. No, you're going to turn around and let us secure the scene, then we'll sort out your identity. Secure the scene, Marcus repeated, incredulous. The only thing that needs securing is your understanding of where you are. This is my home. Callahan stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Sir, we're not going to keep arguing with you. Marcus held up his hands, not in surrender, but in emphasis. And I'm not arguing, I'm explaining, there's a difference. From the balcony, Ellen leaned further over the railing, watching with an unhealthy level of interest. Her face was a mixture of triumph and concern, triumph because she still believed she was right, and concern because the situation was evolving into something far more dramatic than she expected. She hadn't anticipated the drawn weapons, the raised voices, the tension that now radiated through the air like heat from a furnace, but she didn't dare intervene. Instead, she watched, frozen in a mixture of guilt and stubbornness. Marcus inhaled deeply, trying to steady the situation. Look, he said, I understand you got a call, I understand you need to verify, but you're escalating something that doesn't need escalation. Let's reset. Have one of you stand right here. I'll walk slowly into the living room and get my wallet. You'll have clear sight of me the whole time. No sudden movements. But Reed shook his head, as if Marcus had offered the craziest idea imaginable. We don't take instructions from suspects. Marcus stared at him, long, deliberately, silently. Suspect, that's how you see me, no hesitation. Reed didn't answer. His silence was louder than words. Callahan chimed in, we're not here to debate. We are here to make sure this property is secure. By harassing the person who owns it, Marcus shot back. That's your version of security. Reed took that as defiance. His patience snapped. Last chance, turn around, hands behind your back. But Marcus didn't move. Instead, he took a slow step backward, deliberately lowering himself into a chair near the patio table. He crossed one leg over the other, a gesture so calm it infuriated the officers further. No, I'm not turning around. I'm not being handcuffed for lounging at my own home. That's unreasonable, and you know it. Sir, Reed barked, stepping forward aggressively, I'm giving you a lawful order. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Is it lawful? Because detaining a homeowner without evidence, cause, or threat, that sounds like an abuse of authority, and that's something I promised myself I'd never tolerate again. Reed's jaw twitched. Callahan's fingers twitched near his holster. Marcus could feel the danger rising, danger not from the officers' weapons, but from their pride. Pride was the most volatile element on a scene like this. Pride turned minor misunderstandings into viral tragedies. Pride turned assumptions into violence. Pride turned reasonable officers into reckless ones. Marcus tried one final time. Look at me, he said, his tone firm but controlled. I am not a threat. I am not resisting. I am trying to help you do your job without making mistakes you can't undo. Please take a breath, take a step back, think. But the plea didn't land the way he hoped. Reed scoffed. Oh, now you want to teach us how to do our job. Someone has to, Marcus muttered. That was the spark. Callahan stepped forward abruptly, shouting, Stand up, now. Marcus remained still. Not unless we do this reasonably. The officers moved in closer, boxing him in, not physically touching him yet, but their body language made their intention painfully clear. Marcus knew staying seated much longer would only escalate things further. Slowly, without sudden movements, he rose to his feet. Reed's hand twitched. Callahan's breath shortened. The tension was razor-thin. Marcus raised both hands slightly. I'm standing, now what? Reed pointed toward the house. No more nonsense, walk with us. Marcus blinked. So now you'll go with me instead of cuffing me. Callahan's jaw clenched. We're escorting you, don't push it. Marcus exhaled again, his patience thinning. Fine, but slow, and don't treat me like I'm breaking in. He took one step toward the living room door. Reed misread it again. Stop, hands higher. Marcus froze. Are you trying to create a problem? Because that's what it feels like. We decide what the problem is, Reed snapped. And that was it. The moment Marcus realized these officers weren't just making mistakes. They were committed to misunderstanding him. He lowered his hands slightly, looked Reed dead in the eyes, and said quietly, You're out of control, and I'm done trying to help you fix this. The shift in his tone startled both officers, not because it was loud, but because it carried an authority they hadn't expected. What neither of them knew was that Marcus had exercised more patience in these last few minutes than he usually did in entire negotiations. But when he reached his limit, he didn't explode. He acted. Because now he'd given them every chance to do their jobs, and their next move would decide his. The standoff in Marcus's backyard had reached a boiling point. The two officers stood rigid, tense, and unwilling to back down, their pride wrapped tightly around their judgment. Marcus could see it clearly now. They weren't listening, weren't thinking, and certainly weren't considering the escalation they themselves were causing. They were too committed to the role they believed they were playing, protectors confronting an intruder. And in their rigid worldview, anything Marcus said, any logic, any explanation, was dismissed the moment it left his mouth. Marcus had given them patience, calmness, cooperation, and multiple chances to rethink, yet every attempt was met with more hostility. And now, as he stood barefoot on the patio stones, the water drying from his skin under the afternoon sun, he realized something important. They didn't respect his words, but they were about to respect something else, something far bigger, something neither of them could have imagined when they stepped through that gate. Without breaking eye contact with either officer, Marcus slowly lowered his hands, not in surrender, but with confidence. It was a deliberate move, one that immediately raised the officer's tension. Reed's voice shot out sharply, "Hands up, what are you doing?" Marcus didn't flinch. "Relax, I'm making a phone call." "You are not making a call," Callahan snapped, stepping forward. Marcus's voice cut through the air like steel. "Try to stop me." The authority in his tone halted the officers mid-step. Something in his voice hit them deeper than his words. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't fear. It was certainty, certainty that came from power, from connections, from a level of influence neither officer could sense but instantly felt. Marcus reached calmly for the phone on the patio table, his movements steady and controlled. The officers watched cautiously, but something in them hesitated to intervene this time. Marcus picked up the phone, tapped the screen, and hit a single contact. Just one, no dialing, no searching, one name at the very top of his list. The call connected almost instantly. A voice answered. Calm, firm, authoritative. "Marcus, everything all right?" Marcus kept his eyes locked on the officers. "No," he said plainly, "I'm being harassed at my own residence. I need this handled immediately." The voice on the other end sharpened. "Who's on the property?" "Two local officers," Marcus replied. "Names, Reed and Callahan. They entered without cause, ignored identification offers, and escalated repeatedly. They're demanding to detain me on my own property." There was a brief pause. Not hesitation, processing. Then the voice spoke again, clipped and decisive. "Understood, stay where you are, I'll deal with it. They'll be gone shortly." Marcus hung up. Just like that. No pleading. No arguing. No fear. Just a precise, quiet exchange that carried more weight than any shouting match ever could. Reed frowned, confused and irritated. "Who did you just call?" he demanded. Marcus picked up a towel and draped it casually over his shoulders. "Someone who outranks you," he said simply, "and someone who doesn't tolerate incompetence." Callahan scoffed, trying to reclaim his authority. "Nice try, that little performance isn't gonna." He didn't get to finish. The officers' radios crackled violently, loud enough that even Ellen heard the static from her balcony. Both men instinctively grabbed for their radios as a commanding voice thundered through, sharp enough to slice the tension clean in half. "Unit 72 and Unit 46, stand down immediately. Do not touch the resident. Do not question him. Do not speak to him further. Exit the property now." Reed froze. Callahan's face drained of color. That voice wasn't a dispatcher. That wasn't a routine order. That was someone high, very high, high enough to bypass protocol and cut straight through the chain of command. Reed tried to respond, his thumb trembling on the radio. Command, we were responding to a trespassing." The voice interrupted, with chilling authority. "You were misinformed. You are to remove yourselves from the property immediately. Further action will be discussed at headquarters. Confirm." Reed swallowed hard. "See confirmed." Callahan's voice cracked slightly as he echoed, "Confirmed." The backyard fell into a stunned silence. The officers stood there, struggling to process what had just happened. Moments earlier, they'd been ready to cuff Marcus, confident, aggressive, and certain of their authority. Now they stood like scolded schoolboys, stripped of the superiority they'd been clinging to. Marcus remained calm, his expression unreadable. He watched them quietly, towel resting around his shoulders, no anger in his posture, just a cool, steady awareness that everything was now shifting in his direction. And the officers felt that shift like a weight pressing down on their chests. Ellen, still on her balcony, stared with her mouth slightly open. She'd expected a confrontation. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the officers to freeze. She hadn't expected the commanding voice. And she certainly hadn't expected Marcus to make one phone call that changed the entire atmosphere. Callahan cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sir, we, apologize for any misunderstanding." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Do you?" Reed stiffened, clearly uncomfortable. "We were acting on a call." And now you're acting on a correction, Marcus replied coldly. Leave. The officers exchanged a glance, one filled with humiliation and fear, before they turned and began walking toward the gate. Their steps were stiff, their shoulders tense, their pride shattered. But Marcus wasn't done. Not even close. Officers, he called after them. They froze. Slowly, they turned back. You might want to keep your phones on, Marcus said. You'll be getting calls, many of them. Reed's throat bobbed in a hard swallow. Callahan looked like he'd just been sentenced. They didn't answer. They didn't argue. They simply left, quiet, shaken, and completely unprepared for what was coming next. Because the man they tried to detain wasn't just a millionaire lounging by a pool. He was someone with influence powerful enough to make departments tremble. And the fallout. It was only beginning. The moment officers Reed and Callahan stepped out of Marcus's gate, the weight of what had just happened began to crash over them like a tidal wave. Their boots hit the pavement, but neither man moved toward the patrol car. They stood frozen, staring straight ahead, trying to process how a situation they believed they controlled had flipped so violently. Reed wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, though the afternoon wasn't particularly hot anymore. Callahan ran a trembling hand across his mouth, his eyes darting toward the ground as if answers might appear in the cracks of the sidewalk. Inside, Marcus sat down again in the same patio chair, towel around his shoulders, posture relaxed, not because he was calm, but because he was in control now. He had given the officers every opportunity to correct themselves. They had refused, and now consequences were inevitable. He took a slow sip from the water bottle beside him, listening distantly as his phone buzzed with a single incoming message. Stand by, they won't be the only ones leaving today. A.T. Marcus allowed himself a short exhale, not quite a smile, but close. He wasn't vindictive by nature, but he was a firm believer in accountability, especially when people in positions of power used that power recklessly. Out front, Reed and Callahan's radios crackled again. Both officers instinctively reached for them, then froze when they heard who was speaking. Officers, report to headquarters. Now, this is a direct order from the chief. Do not make additional stops. Do not engage with anyone else. Return immediately. The chief never issued orders over open radio. Ever. That was the first sign that whatever consequences awaited them at headquarters would be far worse than anything they imagined. Callahan's voice shook. Chief, can we explain? The response was ice cold. No, you'll explain when you get here. Move. Reed felt the blood drain from his face. He opened the patrol car door with a shaky hand, climbed in, and slammed it shut harder than necessary, frustration mixing with dread. Callahan got in beside him without a word. As they pulled away, Ellen watched from her balcony, her earlier excitement gone. Her heart thudded against her ribs, but unlike the officers, she wasn't feeling fear of disciplinary consequences. She was feeling fear of being publicly exposed. She knew she had created this. She knew she had escalated something harmless into something dangerous. And deep down, she knew she had done it for all the wrong reasons. Marcus glanced up and caught her eye. That 1 second of eye contact felt like a spotlight shining on her guilt. She darted back inside. Meanwhile, across the city, the chief of police was packing in his office, jaw tight, cell phone clenched in his fist. He had just gotten off the phone with a man whose name carried enough influence to make entire departments scramble. The chief hadn't yelled, he hadn't argued. He had simply listened, stiff-backed, as he was told, clearly, calmly, and unmistakably, that 2 of his officers had overstepped, escalated, and endangered someone who was not only completely innocent, but also deeply connected in ways he could not afford to ignore. The chief dropped heavily into his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew exactly who Marcus was, not just a wealthy resident, not just a notable businessman, not just a man with connections. Marcus was part of a major national oversight foundation, the kind that reviewed law enforcement grants, federal funding approvals, and policy compliance reports. The same foundation whose input often determined which departments got millions in resources or didn't. And now that man had just been harassed, humiliated, and nearly detained by two of his own officers. The chief wasn't angry because of Marcus's status. He wasn't afraid because of the Foundation's reach. He was furious because his department had allowed bias, ego, and poor judgment to override basic protocol, and now the entire department's future might be on the line. He called his deputy, "Get internal affairs ready and call legal, we're going to need them." Back at Marcus's home, he stood, walked inside, and changed into fresh clothes. Not rushed, not flustered, just calmly preparing himself for the chain of meetings, phone calls, and fallout that he knew would unfold in the next 48 hours. His assistant knocked lightly on the doorframe. "I saw the officers leaving. Are you okay?" Marcus nodded. "I'm fine, they're not." She hesitated. "Do you want me to call the HOA about the neighbor?" "Not yet," he replied. "That conversation will happen after the dust settles." Outside, as dusk painted the horizon gold, Marcus stepped into his home office, phone in hand. A new message appeared, this time from someone higher than the chief. "We'll be conducting a full review of the department. Expect contact tonight." He set the phone down and let the silence settle. One call. That was all it took. Not because Marcus wanted revenge. Not because he enjoyed watching people lose their jobs. But because the officers had made choices, dangerous choices, rooted in bias, fueled by ego, and executed with arrogance. And choices have consequences. By the time the sun fully set, the ripples of the afternoon's events were already reaching the highest corners of local government. Reed and Callahan's fate wasn't the only thing changing. Entire policies, entire procedures, even the neighbor's false report, everything was about to come under scrutiny. And for Marcus, this was only the beginning of holding people accountable. Because when people weaponize assumptions, someone eventually has to hold the line. And today that someone was him. The next morning arrived not with calm, but with an electric tension pulsing through the police department. Officers Reed and Callahan entered headquarters with the dread of men marching toward their own sentencing. Conversations around the building quieted as they passed. Colleagues who normally greeted them with casual nods instead stared, whispered, or quickly looked away. Everyone had heard the radio call. Everyone knew something massive had happened. And everyone suspected this wouldn't end with a mild reprimand. Inside the chief's office, the atmosphere was thunderous. He sat behind his desk with arms crossed, jaw locked tight, every inch of him radiating the fury of a man who'd been blindsided by his own officer's recklessness. Internal Affairs was already seated across from him, folders open, laptops ready, badges displayed. Reed and Callahan entered hesitantly, exchanging a nervous glance before taking their seats. The chief didn't start with a lecture. He didn't yell. Instead, he pressed a button on a remote, and the large monitor in the room flickered to life. Bodycam footage. Every second of yesterday's confrontation. Every raised voice. Every unnecessary command. Every escalation. Every moment, they ignored Marcus's attempts to de-escalate. The footage played like a slow-motion disaster film. Reed swallowed hard. Callahan couldn't lift his eyes from the floor. The chief paused the video when Reed barked, "Turn around now," at a man standing in swim trunks in his own backyard. He clicked again to the part where Callahan insisted Marcus was resisting simply for questioning them. Every frame was an indictment of poor judgment, bias, and a complete disregard for protocol. Internal Affairs began asking questions, sharp, direct, unforgiving. Why didn't you request backup before escalating? Why didn't you verify with dispatch before entering private property? Why didn't you ask the caller for more information? Why did you ignore the resident's explanation? Every question hit the officers like a strike. Every answer they gave dug the hole deeper. Then Internal Affairs shifted to Ellen, the neighbor whose panic-fueled reports sparked everything. Her recorded 911 call echoed through the room, her exaggerated tone, her insistence that the man didn't look like he belonged. her vague, racially coded descriptions, her refusal to state anything factual, the words suspicious and dangerous repeated like a script she had practiced. The chief paused the audio. Two officers acted on a call with zero evidence, but the caller's motivation, that's a problem too. He nodded to an IA agent who opened Ellen's file. Turns out Ellen had made similar calls over the years, always vague, always accusatory, always targeting people who didn't seem to belong. Not one of her reports had ever resulted in a legitimate incident. Most had been dismissed as misunderstandings. But a pattern had been forming for years, one no one had bothered to address, until now. The chief's voice was low but cutting. You let her personal bias become your professional action. That's a violation on every level. Meanwhile, across town, Ellen sat in her living room, staring at her ringing phone with dread. The HOA president had already called her, her voice tight with disapproval. We received a report from authorities. They want to speak with you about your role in yesterday's incident. Ellen's heart nearly stopped. She'd never expected it to go this far. She'd assumed the officers would simply scare Marcus off, or at the very least confirm her suspicions and leave. But instead, the fallout was spiraling beyond her control. Back at the station, internal affairs continued pressing the officers. You escalated without justification. You threatened force without cause. You attempted detainment without probable suspicion. And the resident warned you multiple times that you were making a mistake, yet you ignored him. Reed clenched his jaw. We were responding to a trespass call. IA shot back immediately. A call based on bias, lacking evidence, and without verification. That's not policing, that's profiling. The chief pressed play again. This time, the audio captured Marcus's voice clearly, calm and steady. You're making a very big mistake. Then the moment his phone call overturned the whole situation. The chief's posture shifted when the commanding voice on the radio barked orders to stand down. Hearing that voice again only reminded him how close the department came to ruin. The footage paused on Callahan's stunned expression as the order came through. It was the exact moment he realized they were not just wrong, they were catastrophically wrong. After an hour of review, the chief closed the laptop. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then came the words that sealed their fate. You've embarrassed this department. You've jeopardized the safety of a resident. You've acted on bias instead of facts. And because of that, this department is under federal scrutiny. Effective immediately, you are both suspended. Pending the full investigation, termination is likely. Reed's face collapsed. Callahan looked physically ill. Neither dared to argue, not when the evidence was undeniable, not when the chief's rage was justified, not when the ground beneath their careers had already crumbled. Later that day, a formal statement was drafted. An internal investigation has been launched into the conduct of two officers involved in an inappropriate confrontation with a local homeowner. Marcus received a copy directly, accompanied by personal apologies from multiple officials. He didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat, he simply nodded. Accountability had begun, but the process wasn't over. Because now the media knew. And the story was spreading. Fast as the dust finally settled on a situation that never should have happened in the first place, the entire community found itself reflecting on what this moment truly meant. Marcus, standing once again beside the pool where the chaos had erupted just days before, felt a deep mix of relief and disbelief. He had purchased this home for peace, somewhere to relax after long years of building businesses, creating opportunities, and pushing through every barrier placed in his path. Yet even in success, he had been reminded that bias did not check bank accounts, resumes, or titles before showing up at a man's doorstep. But instead of bitterness, Marcus chose a different path. He used this moment to shine a light on a much bigger problem, one that affects countless people who don't have the connections, influence, or resources to defend themselves so swiftly. As news spread of the officer's suspension and pending termination, and as the HOA issued a formal reprimand to Ellen while launching mandatory bias training for all residents, a powerful conversation began rippling through the neighborhood. Homeowners, some embarrassed, some shocked, some newly awakened, knocked on Marcus's door to apologize, to express support, or simply to listen. The incident had become more than a confrontation. It became a reckoning. A chance to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions, stereotypes, and the simple yet dangerous act of deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Marcus didn't shy away from these discussions. In fact, he welcomed them, because he knew real change never begins in press conferences or meeting rooms, but in everyday conversations between neighbors, families, and friends. The police department, too, faced its own moment of self-reflection. Leadership recognized that firing the officers was only the beginning. Training had been outdated, oversight had been lax, and bias, whether conscious or not, had been allowed to influence decisions for far too long. The chief issued a public statement acknowledging the failures in judgment and promising a comprehensive overhaul of response protocols. It wasn't about pleasing critics or avoiding lawsuits. It was about rebuilding trust that had been shaken for years, long before Marcus's incident made national headlines. For the first time in a long time, the community began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But perhaps the most powerful lesson came from how quickly everything had escalated. One phone call, one assumption, one snap judgment. That was all it took to bring a man from enjoying his afternoon to almost being handcuffed in his own yard. Many viewers would see Marcus's wealth and think the story worked out because he had power. In some ways, that's true. His connections made accountability impossible to avoid. But that is exactly why the story matters, because so many people would never have been believed, never received an apology, never seen justice. And that is why stories like this need to be told, shared, and discussed. They remind us that respect must be universal, not conditional, that dignity is not optional, and that the system must work fairly for everyone, not just those with influence. As Marcus looked out across his yard, listening to the quiet ripple of the pool water, he realized something important. He had not asked to become a symbol of anything. But life has a way of choosing its moments. And when those moments come, what matters is how they are used. He chose to turn anger into awareness, humiliation into education, and conflict into community reflection. And in doing so, he helped spark changes that would protect the next person, someone without wealth, without connections, without a powerful friend on speed dial. That, he believed, was the real victory. Now, before we close this story, I want to leave you with a question. What would you do if you saw something like this happening in real life? Would you speak up? Would you challenge assumptions? Would you stand for fairness even when it's uncomfortable? These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary ones, because real change begins with ordinary people making extraordinary choices in the small moments that matter. Thank you so much for staying with me through this powerful and emotional journey. Stories like these remind us why awareness is important, why conversations must continue, and why standing up for justice, no matter who you are, can make a difference. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Swift Tale so you never miss more eye-opening stories just like this one. And don't forget to comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. What part of this story stood out to you? What lessons do you think we should carry forward? Your engagement helps these stories reach even more people, and together we can spark discussions that truly matter. Until next time, this is Swift Tale signing off. The days following the incident rippled with a tension the neighborhood had never experienced before. What began as a quiet suburban enclave suddenly found itself thrust into the spotlight, its residents confronted with the uncomfortable truth that a peaceful community was not immune to the darker consequences of bias and wrongful assumptions. Social media picked up the story within hours, and by evening, clips, photos, and eyewitness accounts circulated across platforms, painting a picture that left viewers stunned. Comments flooded in, some expressing outrage, others disbelief, and many simply asking, how could something like this still be happening? The neighborhood, once proud of its pristine lawns and calm streets, was now being discussed in national conversations about privilege, race, and policing. Residents who had lived beside Marcus for months, even years, suddenly found themselves reassessing the assumptions they had carried without noticing. For many, it was a humbling and uncomfortable awakening. Neighbors who had rarely spoken to Marcus before now found themselves deeply unsettled by what had happened, some feeling guilty for not recognizing his experiences sooner, others embarrassed that such an incident occurred within their own community. Block discussions sprung up spontaneously on driveways, porches, and sidewalks. People questioned each other, questioned themselves, questioned the systems they had always assumed were fair. In these raw conversations, they confronted their own biases, some conscious, others buried under years of unexamined habits. Ellen, the neighbor whose call had triggered everything, became a central topic of conversation. Some residents defended her, insisting she had simply been trying to protect the neighborhood. But most did not share her view. Many felt betrayed by her actions, realizing that calling the police without verifying anything, especially about a neighbor she had seen countless times, revealed not vigilance, but prejudice. Her attempt to lay low backfired as doorbells rang and messages poured in from residents demanding an explanation, or at the very least, accountability. She avoided her balcony, avoided leaving her house, avoided the spotlight that was now uncomfortably fixed on her doorstep. Meanwhile, the police department faced its own public pressure. Citizens from beyond the neighborhood demanded transparency, many criticizing the officers for escalating instead of assessing. People questioned their training, their decision-making, and their inability to recognize that a man relaxing in his own pool posed no threat. Local activists held peaceful gatherings outside the precinct, holding signs that read, "Do better," and "Reform starts with accountability." Editorials appeared in newspapers, urging systemic change and warning against the dangers of unchecked assumptions. The chief of police, grappling with the swelling backlash, issued a statement acknowledging the officers' violations of procedure. It was the first step in what would become a more aggressive internal investigation into bias-based policing. Marcus himself became an unexpected symbol in the unfolding storm. Though deeply frustrated by the ordeal, he maintained a calm, composed presence in the public eye. When interviewed by reporters, he avoided inflammatory accusations and instead focused on the broader implications. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about anyone who could have been in my position, people who don't have the resources I do." This time, the story ended differently, but that's not always the case. His clarity resonated with thousands, and many praised him for using his platform not for revenge, but for change. His employees, partners, and friends reached out in solidarity, expressing disbelief that a man of his accomplishments could still be subjected to such treatment. But Marcus reminded them that success did not erase systemic issues, it simply offered him a louder voice to address them. Behind the scenes, he met with community leaders, police officials, and legal advisors. He didn't want the officers merely penalized. He wanted a lasting shift in how such situations were handled. To him, justice meant preventing the next incident, not just punishing the last one. Across the neighborhood, parents used the incident as a teaching opportunity. Conversations around dinner tables shifted. Children asked why the police came, why someone would call on a neighbor, why people treated Marcus differently. For some parents, these discussions were uncomfortable but necessary. For others, it was a chance to correct assumptions they themselves had once held. Schools even incorporated the incident into discussions about fairness, community responsibility, and empathy, recognizing that shaping the next generation's mindset was crucial for long-term change. But even as reflection spread, not everyone reacted with sincerity. A small number of residents complained about the unwanted attention, insisting that the community was being unfairly judged. "Mistakes happen," they argued. "Why can't people just move on?" Yet such comments were quickly drowned out by residents who recognized that silence or dismissal was part of the problem. They refused to let the neighborhood slip back into complacency. HOA leaders, in turn, felt pressure to respond decisively. They organized emergency meetings where residents demanded new rules to prevent racial profiling, addressed concerns about community surveillance culture, and insisted on accountability measures for anyone who called authorities without proper cause. The HOA publicly apologized to Marcus and assured residents that updated policies, guidelines, and educational workshops would be implemented immediately. This aftermath was not just cleanup, it was transformation. The neighborhood had been forced to confront something uncomfortable and undeniable, and the only way forward was through honesty, change, and unity. People were shaken, but shaken awake. They recognized that safety does not come from suspicion and community does not come from exclusion. True safety grows from trust, communication, and understanding. True community thrives when every resident is seen as deserving of respect. By the end of the week, as camera crews packed up and the neighborhood slowly returned to its outward normalcy, something inside it had shifted forever. For the first time, residents looked at one another not with assumptions, but with awareness. Not with fear, but with humility. Not with division, but with hope that the next chapter would be better than the last. As the dust settled on the initial emotional aftermath, a more serious and complex phase of the situation began to unfold: the legal ramifications. Marcus had no intention of letting the events slide into the abyss of forgotten controversies. While some may have assumed that the fallout from the police encounter would fade with time, Marcus made it clear from the beginning that this incident wasn't just a matter of personal grievance. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem. He wanted to ensure that those responsible for the mishandling of his case would be held accountable, but he also wanted lasting reform to prevent similar situations from ever happening again. In the days following the public revelations, Marcus's legal team, which included several high-profile civil rights attorneys, prepared to file a formal lawsuit against the police department. The charges were clear: racial profiling, unlawful detainment, false arrest, and violation of constitutional rights. What made this case different from others, however, was Marcus's strategic approach. This wasn't just about compensation for damages. This was about setting a precedent for how law enforcement would handle situations involving racial bias, personal assumptions, and the violation of individual rights. As the legal process began to move forward, Reed and Callahan found themselves facing not only internal disciplinary actions, but also the weight of the civil lawsuit. Their suspension had escalated into something far more serious: legal exposure. The public scrutiny grew with every development in the case. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice for Marcus and an end to what they saw as institutionalized prejudice. The case became a flashpoint for wider conversations on policing, justice, and accountability. National media outlets picked up the story, bringing the department's actions under even more intense scrutiny. Marcus's legal team was meticulous. They presented undeniable evidence: bodycam footage, eyewitness testimonies, and even phone records showing how the officers ignored protocols and escalated a simple situation into a potential tragedy. But the most damning evidence came from the neighbor's call. Ellen's words, fueled by racial assumptions, were not just reckless, they were the catalyst for everything that happened afterward. The legal team filed a separate complaint against Ellen for making a false report to the authorities based on her biased perceptions. Though she had been the one to make the call, the responsibility didn't rest solely on her. The officers had followed through without exercising judgment, but her actions certainly played a significant role in the escalation. In the coming weeks, the tension around the case reached its peak. The police department hired a team of attorneys to defend the actions of Reed and Callahan, but it was clear from the outset that the defense was going to be difficult. The department could not dispute the fact that Marcus had been treated unjustly and that the officers' behavior had violated established protocols. Internal investigations confirmed that Reed and Callahan had failed to act in good faith, and their actions, particularly the refusal to listen to Marcus's attempts to explain himself, had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Amidst the legal battle, one of Marcus's lawyers, Aisha Thompson, made a bold statement to the press. This case is not just about one man's rights being violated. It's about sending a message to law enforcement everywhere that people cannot be treated as suspects based on their skin color, their wealth, or their status. Every citizen deserves the same protection under the law. It was a statement that resonated deeply with the public. While the officers' defense lawyers tried to spin their actions as an unfortunate misunderstanding, the overwhelming public sentiment, bolstered by the footage and legal arguments, painted a different picture. The police department, already under scrutiny for its practices, found itself at the center of a growing movement that demanded more from law enforcement: more accountability, more transparency, and more respect for civil rights. As Marcus's lawsuit progressed, it became a battle not only for justice in his case, but also for broader police reform. Activists and civil rights organizations rallied behind him, holding public demonstrations and raising funds for the legal costs of the lawsuit. The story of a wealthy black man being harassed and wrongfully detained by police had struck a nerve with many who saw it as a reflection of the broader challenges facing marginalized communities, especially those who lacked the financial resources or connections to fight back. Marcus's willingness to stand up, not just for himself, but for every person who might face similar discrimination, inspired many to take action. The public outcry and legal momentum pushed the police department into damage control. In an unprecedented move, the department announced that it would be undergoing comprehensive internal reforms. The chief publicly acknowledged that the officer's actions were not just a failure of protocol, but a failure of empathy. "We have failed to uphold the trust our community has placed in us," he said in a press conference, "and we are committed to doing the work necessary to rebuild that trust." The department promised increased training on racial profiling, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques. But for many, the damage had already been done. While reform within the police department was a positive step, it was just the beginning. The broader issue of racial bias in policing was not something that could be resolved by one department or through a few changes to training programs. It required nationwide action, from Congress to local governments, from activists to everyday citizens. The conversation sparked by Marcus's case was not just about how law enforcement interacted with individuals. It was about how society viewed and treated people of color, especially when they had the wealth and status to challenge those assumptions. As Marcus's lawsuit continued to gain traction, the city began to prepare for a settlement offer. The police department, recognizing the strength of Marcus's case and the mounting public pressure, opted to settle the lawsuit out of court. The settlement included a significant financial award for Marcus, along with commitments from the department to implement the reforms they had promised. The settlement also required the police department to create a community oversight board to review all incidents involving police misconduct and to ensure that the department's new policies were being followed. But Marcus's work was far from over. He knew that true reform required sustained effort and attention. In the months that followed, he launched a nonprofit dedicated to supporting communities affected by police misconduct. The nonprofit would focus on providing legal assistance to victims of racial profiling, advocating for policy changes, and ensuring that law enforcement agencies across the country were held accountable for their actions. Through all of this, Marcus never lost sight of the bigger picture. His fight wasn't about one incident. It was about creating a world where people could live without the constant fear of being judged based on the color of their skin, where wealth and status didn't determine whether someone was treated fairly. He had used his position to make a difference, but he knew that real change could only come when everyone, rich or poor, black or white, officer or civilian, committed to fighting for a more just society. The moment the settlement was finalized, Marcus became the face of a much larger movement that reached far beyond the confines of his own neighborhood. Media outlets around the country were now asking one simple question: what does this case mean for the future of policing in America? The story of a successful black millionaire facing wrongful detainment by police had struck a nerve with the public, but the deeper implications of the case, how it highlighted systemic biases, flawed policing practices, and the need for reform, made it a flashpoint for a national conversation. The mainstream media's reaction was swift. National news networks ran endless segments, providing in-depth coverage of the case, from the initial incident to the settlement. CNN, NBC, and Fox all picked up the story, giving it prominent airtime. There were experts and analysts, lawyers and activists, weighing in on the broader consequences. Some believed the outcome was a rare victory for accountability in law enforcement. Others argued that a mere settlement wasn't enough to address the root causes of racial profiling and police misconduct. As the coverage grew, so did the division in public opinion. On one side, there were those who saw Marcus's victory as a breakthrough, proof that with enough resources and determination, Even those with power could expose and challenge systemic racism in policing. On the other side were those who felt that the case had been blown out of proportion. Some conservative commentators dismissed it as a rich man's problem, claiming that Marcus's wealth and influence had made it possible for him to hold the police accountable. Others suggested that the officers involved had made an honest mistake and shouldn't have been fired or punished so severely. The debate reached all corners of American society. The media's portrayal of the case and the subsequent reactions exposed just how deeply entrenched these issues were. On the streets of cities across the country, protests for police reform surged once again. Protesters carried signs that read, "Stop racial profiling" and "Accountability now." The calls for justice became louder and the demands for institutional change more urgent. Activists rallied around Marcus, seeing him not only as a victim of injustice, but as a beacon of hope for all those who had been marginalized and silenced by the system. But the case was not just about one individual. It had become symbolic of a wider problem that affected millions of people, particularly people of color, who lived with the constant threat of being unjustly treated, profiled, or detained by law enforcement. Public opinion was split, but one thing was clear. The case had opened a much-needed conversation about race, policing, and the power dynamics at play within the system. For Marcus, the media attention brought both positive and negative aspects. While he appreciated the chance to speak out on behalf of those who didn't have the same platform, he also found the constant media presence overwhelming. Journalists showed up at his home uninvited, cameras flashing at every turn, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had shaken the system. The pressure of being thrust into the national spotlight, especially when his story was so raw and personal, weighed heavily on him. Yet, he remained calm, controlled, and focused on his mission. He refused to let the noise drown out his core message. This wasn't just about one person, this was about everyone. Behind the scenes, the media coverage continued to push the story forward. Marcus began to receive more invitations to speak at forums, on talk shows, and even at academic conferences. He became an unofficial spokesperson for police reform, not because he wanted to be, but because his story had highlighted the cracks in a system that, for too long, had operated with impunity. His insights on the issue of racial bias in policing were being sought by people across the country. Business leaders, lawmakers, and educators all turned to him as a voice of reason and experience. He spoke with humility, understanding that his position gave him a unique opportunity to drive the conversation forward. He shared his thoughts on the systemic nature of the problem and how true change required not just policy reforms, but shifts in cultural attitudes. The national response was diverse, with both praise and criticism following Marcus as he navigated his newfound role as an advocate for change. The political landscape was also impacted. The story made its way into Congress, where some lawmakers used it as evidence of the need for new legislation on police reform. Others, however, took a more defensive stance, pushing back against the idea that police misconduct was widespread. The debate in Washington grew heated, and while some bills aimed at improving policing practices were introduced, it became clear that real political change would take time and would require persistent pressure from the public. Despite the division, one thing was clear: Marcus's case had broken a significant barrier. The national conversation about police bias, racial profiling, and accountability was no longer something hidden behind closed doors or dismissed as an isolated issue. It was front and center. People who had never paid much attention to the issue now found themselves forced to confront it, and the conversation didn't just end with Marcus. In the weeks and months that followed, new cases of police misconduct came to light, fueling further protests, legal challenges, and demands for reform. For Marcus, the media whirlwind was exhausting, but it also presented an opportunity to influence change on a broader scale. Through interviews and public appearances, he urged people to stay engaged in the fight for justice. "This doesn't end with one case," he said in a viral interview. "This is just the beginning. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep speaking out. We have to keep demanding better." His words resonated with many, and his message of persistence and action became a rallying cry for a movement that was gaining momentum. The media coverage also had its impact on the police department. The chief, once confident in his ability to weather the storm, now found himself under intense pressure to deliver on his promises of reform. Internal Affairs continued its investigation, and new policies were introduced to address the gaps in training, oversight, and accountability. However, for many residents and activists, the department's efforts felt like too little, too late. They wanted action, not just words. And they wanted a system that truly valued the lives and dignity of all people, regardless of their race or status. The media's portrayal of Marcus as a victim of an unjust system had triggered a ripple effect, reaching deep into communities, cities, and states that had been waiting for a catalyst to demand change. As the case continued to gain traction, it became evident that Marcus was not just a bystander in the fight for justice. He was now an active participant, helping to shape a new narrative about race, policing, and power in America. His story was not one of personal revenge, but one of systemic change. And though he had every right to be angry, he chose to channel that energy into creating a lasting impact, one that would resonate long after the cameras turned off. As weeks turned into months following Marcus's landmark case, the ripple effect continued to echo far beyond his suburban neighborhood. The conversation on racial profiling, police accountability, and systemic reform had transformed from a regional concern into a nationwide movement. What had initially been a personal battle for justice was now a collective call for change, one that stretched across state lines, transcended racial boundaries, and gained momentum in ways few had anticipated. The case had not only highlighted flaws within the police department, but had also illuminated the broader issues within the criminal justice system itself. The way Marcus's story resonated with communities across the country was profound, especially in areas where police interactions with minority communities had long been a source of tension. Cities like Ferguson, Baltimore, and Minneapolis, where previous incidents of police violence had sparked protests and outrage, began to see a surge of renewed activism. But this time, the focus was not only on holding individual officers accountable, but on overhauling the entire system that allowed such incidents to happen repeatedly. Civil rights organizations, once operating on the fringes of public discourse, were now at the center of the fight for justice. The NAACP, Black Lives Matter, and other advocacy groups used Marcus's case as a rallying point to push for federal legislation that would mandate police reform across the country. It was no longer enough to offer lip service or small-scale changes in police departments. The conversation was shifting toward the need for comprehensive, systemic reform that would address everything from how officers are trained to how police unions protect officers from accountability. The case had shown that piecemeal fixes would no longer suffice. The entire structure needed to be reevaluated and reformed to ensure that every citizen, regardless of race or background, could feel safe in their own community. But the national impact wasn't just about protests and legislative battles. It also sparked conversations in places where racial bias and police misconduct were rarely discussed. In corporate boardrooms, educational institutions, and community organizations, leaders began reflecting on how their own practices could contribute to the perpetuation of inequality. For the first time, major companies and tech giants like Google, Facebook, and Amazon announced their commitment to addressing racial inequality within their organizations and in society at large. Donations flowed toward organizations that supported police reform, and some companies even adopted mandatory bias and sensitivity training for their employees. While many of these moves were seen as symbolic, they signaled that the conversation about race and policing had permeated into every corner of American life. Marcus himself found that he had become more than just a figurehead in the fight for justice. He had become a bridge, someone who could unite disparate groups under a common cause. As a successful black businessman, he had credibility with those who may have otherwise dismissed the urgency of reform. But he had also made it clear that his fight wasn't about his own privilege. It was about ensuring that no one, regardless of their background, was subjected to the kind of treatment he had faced. His credibility allowed him to speak to a wide range of people, from lawmakers to police officers to ordinary citizens, with a message of empathy, understanding, and change. In his public speeches, Marcus often spoke about the need for systemic change. "This isn't just a policing problem," he said in one of his many interviews. "It's a problem of power, of perception, of the way society has been conditioned to see people based on their race, class, or appearance. It's a problem that starts in the classroom, continues in the workplace, and ultimately plays out in the streets. Until we address those underlying issues, until we change how we see and treat one another, we will never truly be free of this cycle." His words resonated not only with activists, but also with individuals who had never before considered the connection between systemic racism and policing. For many, it was a wake-up call, a chance to examine the biases they had internalized and the ways in which they had contributed to a culture of discrimination. The momentum for reform reached its peak in Washington. In response to the growing public outcry, lawmakers introduced a sweeping police reform bill that included provisions for body cameras on all officers, the establishment of independent oversight committees in every police department, mandatory anti-bias training, and the creation of a national database to track incidents of police misconduct. The bill also aimed to address the issue of qualified immunity, which had long protected officers from being held accountable for unlawful actions. While the bill still faced fierce opposition from certain political factions, it marked a turning point in the national conversation about policing. No longer could anyone deny that change was necessary, and no longer could lawmakers avoid the issue of police reform. Across the country, local governments began to follow suit. Cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago implemented their own reforms, introducing measures to reduce racial disparities in arrests, sentencing, and policing. Some departments took steps to increase community engagement, creating more opportunities for officers to build relationships with the communities they served. Others focused on rethinking policing altogether, exploring alternatives to traditional law enforcement, such as community-led safety initiatives and the expansion of mental health crisis response teams. However, not everyone welcomed these changes. Resistance from police unions, certain political leaders, and even some members of the public was fierce. Many argued that reforming the police was an overreaction, that officers were being unfairly maligned, and that their ability to do their jobs was being undermined. These voices grew louder as the national debate intensified, often framing the issue as a conflict between law and order and social justice. But Marcus's story, and the stories of countless others who had been wronged by the system, reminded the public that the fight was not about weakening law enforcement. It was about making sure that the law was applied fairly to everyone, regardless of their race or background. As Marcus continued to advocate for reform, he also began to see a shift in the way law enforcement approached these issues. He was invited to speak with police chiefs, training officers, and even rank-and-file officers about the importance of recognizing their own biases and learning to engage with communities in a more positive, respectful way. Some officers resisted these discussions, but many others embraced them, understanding that the future of policing depended on their ability to evolve. By the end of the year, Marcus's case had become a turning point in the fight for justice in America. It wasn't just about one man's struggle against injustice. It was about a collective reckoning with the systems that had allowed injustice to thrive for so long. The nationwide impact was undeniable. The calls for reform had become too loud to ignore. People were no longer willing to tolerate a system that failed to protect all its citizens equally. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how quickly and how deeply it would go. Marcus knew the journey was far from over, but as he looked back on the progress that had been made, he saw hope on the horizon. Change was happening, not in a single courtroom, not in a single city, but across the nation. And though the fight was far from finished, he was confident that every step taken toward reform, every voice raised in protest, every law passed to protect the vulnerable, was a step closer to a more just society. As the months rolled by, the winds of change that Marcus had sparked began to grow stronger, but he knew the work was far from done. The fight for justice, Equity and police reform had taken on a life of its own, but true transformation would take time, years, even decades, of continued effort, persistence, and resilience. As the story of his case made its way into the history books, it became clear that Marcus's involvement wasn't just a footnote in the movement for reform. It was the beginning of a lasting legacy. With the national conversation firmly rooted in the need for change, Marcus found himself reflecting on what had truly transpired. In the weeks following the legal victory, he spent less time in the limelight and more time behind closed doors, meeting with activists, legislators, and fellow advocates for reform. He became deeply involved in organizations dedicated to ending racial injustice, supporting victims of police misconduct, and pushing for legislative changes at both the state and federal levels. He understood that while one legal victory was significant, it was the structural changes, those that reached into the heart of law enforcement, education, healthcare, and the judicial system, that would ensure lasting progress. He used his position, influence, and wealth to fund initiatives aimed at these very reforms, recognizing that his personal success meant nothing unless it translated into tangible benefits for others. In one of his many meetings with other advocates, Marcus said, "The work we're doing today isn't just about creating a safer world for my children or your children. It's about creating a world where every child, Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, or otherwise, can grow up without having to worry about the color of their skin determining their fate." These words, simple yet profound, became a cornerstone of his advocacy. The message was clear: reform had to be holistic. It couldn't be confined to police departments. It had to permeate every system that touched the lives of marginalized communities. From the schools children attended to the health care they received, from the way they were treated in the courtroom to the opportunities they were given in the workplace, Marcus's vision for the future demanded nothing less than total equity. One of the most significant moves Marcus made in the wake of his legal victory was establishing his own foundation, the Marcus James Foundation for Justice and Equality. The foundation would focus on three core areas: community empowerment, criminal justice reform, and public education on race and equity. The foundation's first major initiative was the Justice Reform Initiative, a project aimed at supporting communities who had long been underrepresented in policy discussions. With Marcus's influence and the public's increased awareness, the foundation raised millions of dollars within its first year. These funds went toward programs designed to provide legal representation for victims of police misconduct, fund grassroots movements, and launch educational programs to challenge the pervasive myths of racial inequality in the United States. Alongside the foundation's work, Marcus continued to push for comprehensive legislative change. The Justice for All Act, a bill aimed at making police misconduct a federal crime, requiring nationwide de-escalation training for all law enforcement, and establishing independent oversight committees in every major city, was one of the most significant pieces of legislation that Marcus's story helped propel. While the bill faced intense opposition, it also gathered overwhelming support from communities, civil rights groups, and activists. Marcus worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meeting with lawmakers, rallying the public, and using his platform to ensure that the bill was pushed through Congress. But Marcus's story wasn't just about policy changes, it was also about changing hearts and minds. He became a voice for those who felt their stories had been ignored for far too long. In interviews, public speeches, and even personal conversations, he encouraged people to look beyond their differences and recognize the humanity in each other. He understood that systemic change wasn't just about enacting laws, it was about changing the way society viewed one another. His own journey had taught him that the fight for justice required not only action, but empathy and understanding of the struggles of others, particularly those who had been oppressed for generations. Over time, Marcus's legacy began to take shape in unexpected ways. He was invited to speak at universities, corporate conferences, and international summits, where his voice was heard by young activists, students, and leaders from around the world. As his message spread, so did the recognition of his influence. In the years that followed, he received numerous accolades, including human rights awards, honors from prestigious universities, and recognition from civil rights organizations. Yet, despite the accolades and the growing influence of his foundation, Marcus never lost sight of the true mission: to create a future where no one, regardless of their race or status, would be subject to the kind of treatment he had endured. As his influence grew, so did the strength of the movement. What started as a single incident involving a black millionaire being wrongfully detained by the police became a microcosm of a larger societal shift. By bringing attention to systemic racial bias in policing, Marcus had opened the door for others to speak out, to demand more, and to take action. From small-town meetings to nationwide protests, the call for justice was now a permanent fixture in the national discourse. In an interview several years after the case had concluded, Marcus was asked what it felt like to see the changes that had come from his initial fight for justice. "It's humbling," he said, "but it's also just the beginning. Every victory we've won so far is just a stepping stone to something greater. And the true measure of success won't be how many awards I've received or how much money my foundation has raised. It will be in the lives we've changed, the communities we've empowered, and the generations who will grow up knowing that they are worthy of respect and dignity, no matter what." The fight for justice was far from over, but Marcus knew that the road ahead was one of hope, possibility, and transformation. The legacy he was building wasn't just his, it was the collective legacy of every person who had fought, who had stood up, and who had chosen to speak out against injustice. And as the years passed, Marcus's vision for a more just and equal society grew ever closer to becoming a reality.